I was the one who actually filed the declarations of war. Not the famous ones, not the battles you've heard about, but the dry, formal paperwork that came before them, the documents that technically started everything on paper, stamped, sealed, and stacked in neat piles that nobody outside the ministry ever thought twice about. And the strange thing I noticed, sorting through years of these files, is how rarely my own government was the one signing the document that started it. This is the part of the story behind the man history calls Napoleon Bonaparte that gets flattened into a single, repeatable line online, the kind of fact that shows up in a list of surprising history trivia and gets shared a few 100,000 times before anyone checks the rest of the file. That he never actually started a war, that the wars came to him. I worked close enough to the actual paperwork to tell you it's not quite that simple, and it's not quite false either. Let's go through what actually happened, document by document, the way I actually saw it land on desks at the time, because the real answer sits somewhere uncomfortable in between two very confident, very shareable versions of the same decade. In 1802, France and Britain signed the Treaty of Amiens, a real peace agreement meant to end years of fighting. It held for about a year. Then, in May of 1803, Britain formally declared war. Again, not France. That's documented, verifiable, and it's the detail people usually mean when they repeat the claim. The British government broke the peace, not the man who'd later get blamed for restarting the entire conflict. It kept happening in this same pattern for years, almost suspiciously so, year after year, coalition after coalition, like clockwork running on someone else's schedule. In 1805, Austria invaded Bavaria, an ally of France, effectively opening what historians call the War of the Third Coalition, backed by Britain and Russia. In 1806, Prussia issued an ultimatum and moved against France, opening the Fourth Coalition. In 1809, Austria attacked again, opening the Fifth. 4 separate times, the paperwork I'm describing, the actual formal declarations and first military movements, came from someone else's government, not ours. If you only looked at who signed first, the popular claim holds up remarkably well, almost suspiciously well for a man with that particular reputation. But here's the part that complicates the tidy version of this story, the part I think gets quietly dropped because it doesn't fit as neatly into a single shareable sentence online. In 1808, French forces invaded Spain and Portugal. No declaration from either side preceding it, no coalition moving first, no ultimatum sitting on anyone's desk that morning. That war, the one historians call the Peninsular War, was launched by France, full stop. And in 1812, French forces crossed into Russia in one of the largest invasions in European history to that point, again without Russia striking first or declaring anything. Both of those wars do not fit the claim at all, no matter how generously you read the paperwork. Both were started, in the most literal sense of marching an army across a border first, by the man whose defenders like to say never started anything. So which version is true? Genuinely, both halves are, and I think the honest answer is more interesting than either oversimplified version circulating today. It helps to be specific about exactly what those provocations looked like on paper, because ambition can sound vague until you see the list. He crowned himself emperor in 1804. He restructured dozens of small German states into the Confederation of the Rhine, a block of territories now answering to France instead of the old Holy Roman Empire. He placed his own brothers on the thrones of Naples, Spain, Holland, and Westphalia, one after another, real documented appointments, not rumor. Each of those moves, on its own, might have been absorbed, stacked together, year after year, across nearly every border in continental Europe. They read less like the actions of a man minding his own affairs, and more like a slow, methodical redrawing of the entire map. One relative, and one annexation at a time. The coalitions kept forming against France largely because of decisions Napoleon himself kept making, installing his own relatives on thrones across Europe, annexing territories, imposing a continental blockade against British trade that strangled the economies of countries that hadn't asked to be involved in his quarrel with one particular island. Calling that diplomacy is a bit like calling it a friendly suggestion when someone rearranges your furniture while you're out and then acts surprised that you're upset when you get home. Russia's eventual decision to quietly abandon that blockade, reopening trade with Britain, is widely understood as the real trigger for the 1812 invasion, an invasion he launched, even though Russia had broken an economic agreement rather than fired the first shot. The other governments may have signed the literal declarations, but plenty of historians argue those declarations were direct responses to a French government that kept expanding past every border anyone had agreed to. Picture the actual room where I worked. Stacks of correspondence in multiple languages, ultimatums sealed in wax, treaty violations alleged on every side, each government insisting the other one had broken faith first, every single time. There was no clean villain sitting in any of those documents, no single sentence you could point to and say, there, that's where it started. There was an enormously ambitious man whose actions, year after year, reliably provoked exactly the kind of coalition response that then let him say, accurately, that the other side declared war first. He understood, whether anyone admitted it aloud or not, that being technically responded to looks very different in the official record than being the one who provoked the response in the first place, even when the underlying cause traced straight back to him. Here's the detail that genuinely surprised me once I started tracking it across the full span of his rule. The "he never started a war" claim isn't propaganda invented decades later by people with a reason to rehabilitate his image. Versions of this argument go back to his own era, repeated by people who watched those documents land on desks like mine and noticed the same pattern I did, long before anyone needed a tidy online fact to share. It survived this long because it's defensible in a narrow, technical sense, not because it's complete, and there's a difference between a claim that's wrong and a claim that's only telling you a quarter of the story while sounding like it's telling you all of it. It also helps to understand why the claim keeps resurfacing every few years in slightly different forms. Each time, it arrives stripped of context, a single sharp sentence detached from the decade of decisions that made those formal declarations almost inevitable. A fact can be entirely true and still function as a kind of magic trick, directing your attention toward who signed the paper last, while quietly waving away everyone who got pushed, provoked, or economically strangled into signing it. Does that sound like a uniquely Napoleonic kind of argument to you? The sort of thing that only mattered 2 centuries ago in dusty foreign ministries? Or does it sound like something you've seen play out closer to home? Someone who is, technically, telling the truth about who threw the first punch in any single confrontation, while quietly leaving out the years of behavior that made that punch close to inevitable. Maybe you've watched 2 people argue and noticed that whoever raises their voice last gets blamed for starting the fight, even though the person who provoked it for 20 minutes beforehand calmly, reasonably, technically without yelling, walks away looking like the victim. Technically accurate, genuinely misleading, both at once, the same way these declarations of war were, filed in neat folders that told the truth without telling the whole truth. I still have a strange, specific memory from those years, watching ambassadors arrive with formal letters, each one certain they were the side responding to provocation, each one technically correct about who had signed first. Napoleon didn't always start the wars on paper. He spent over a decade making it almost impossible for those wars not to start eventually, by someone, somewhere, and the paperwork on my desk just happened to keep landing in someone else's hand first. I filed every one of those documents in order. None of them, on their own, told you who actually started anything. You had to read all of them together to understand that.